at yet another press conference. We're becoming very good at these types of things. My name is Lerato Ngobeni. I serve as the national spokesperson of the organization. And before we get started, I will introduce my colleagues. I will start on my right, far right. We have Dr. Nasipi Moya, who is the Chief Director of Governance for our organization. Next to her, we have Mr. Alistair Shaw, who is the Director of Legal. So it's very obvious why he's here. On my immediate right is Michael Beaumont, who is our National Director, National Chairperson. We've got, is our National Director of everything. And then, of course, my colleague to my left is Samgelo Mkopozi, who is the National Director of Communications. So you see where I get all the directors from. So thank you for that. Without wasting too much of your time, I do want to thank you all of the time for indulging us as we invite you to these conferences. I'm going to allow Mr. Michael Beaumont to give you a broad context as to why we're here. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just ask the speakers to just follow as we push through, so I don't have to come back to the mic up until we do the Q&A. So we'll have Michael Beaumont, Alistair Shaw, followed by Dr. Nasipi Moya, and then we'll open it up again for a Q&A. Thank you very much. Michael Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Lerato. Greetings to members of the media present here today, and to South Africans who are following these events online, and to my colleagues up front, greetings to you all. This occasion is a very important one because when political parties take legal action, it's very important for us to explain why we are taking these steps. And I think, it's so easy to do so when you're talking about a clear-cut case, when you are fighting for services and very black and white issues. But I think today is a very challenging scenario in as much as it relates to a cause very close to the hearts of South Africans, which is transparency in our political system. And in that particular regard, I would like to say that ActionSA is massively in support of political transparency. And in a moment, you will see not just how we have been fundamentally involved in ensuring we are transparent in the party funding process ourselves, but how we would like to contribute towards the ongoing improvement of transparency. But we are here today because My Vote Counts, a non-profit organization, has filed papers in May this year, which seek to challenge elements of the Party Funding Act. And certainly we agree there are parts of the Party Funding Act that need to be challenged, and we would support such challenges. But unfortunately, the approach they have taken creates unintended consequences which fundamentally challenge important democratic principles. I note with great interest their papers talk about this application being concerned with strengthening democracy. However, it is our great concern that these papers do exactly the opposite. And what they do is marginalize emerging political parties not yet represented in Parliament, and favor those who are in Parliament as incumbent political parties. Essentially, let me say from the outset that ActionSA wrote to My Vote Counts through our attorneys, and we sought a meeting without prejudice. We actually wanted to engage this organization for the purpose of seeing how we could work together, because we recognize the principles of transparency are important. We think their application was misguided, and we thought that they would benefit greatly were they to understand the perhaps unintended consequences of their actions. As it is, My Vote Counts did not deem it necessary to meet with ActionSA, so I regret we now find ourselves opposing these court papers in a fairly acrimonial manner. Essentially, the nature of My Vote Counts case deals with a number of issues, the most pertinent of which, for the sake of our challenge, is that they seek to remove a disclosure limit whatsoever, so that every donation received from South Africans to political parties would require a public disclosure, as well as various other elements of their case. Essentially, at this point in time, it is hugely important to paint why this issue concerns ActionSA. And let me make this abundantly clear. Political parties that are represented in Parliament award themselves a share of 1.3 billion rand in taxpayer funding every year. If anyone, is finding themselves, not believing what they just heard, I'll say it again. The taxpayers of South Africa pay 1.3 billion rand to political parties represented in Parliament. And of course, who decides that amount of money? The parliamentarians do, for the benefit of their own party. And while the budget for education and crime fighting and healthcare goes down every single year, I assure you, watch carefully, that'll be the budget that never goes down. And of course, what you then have is incumbent political parties funding themselves so that they can plan and structure their organizations around regular and guaranteed income of tens of millions of rands every single month. And emerging political parties like ActionSA, and emerging ones that are proven to have a genuine constituency, unable to access those funds, and we have to raise every cent we have privately. This is something we have been doing up until now, and something we are willing to continue doing, because there are many South Africans across the spectrum. And I make that point because there are donors that give ActionSA 10 rand, and as you've seen from our disclosures, there are donors who give ActionSA millions of rands. And that is because people see ActionSA as a viable alternative that can grow at the expense of the ANC. So what happens when you have My Vote Counts going to court and potentially succeeding in their claim? And now every cent of party funding has to be disclosed. Well, the first thing is fundraising dries up, because what we know in a South African political context is that many donors are fearful of reprisal from the ANC and even in some cases the DA, where they see that a donor is supporting ActionSA, and those political parties, through their representatives in government, are able to exact reprisals upon those donors through the manner in which their businesses are regulated or dealt with, or through tax, etc. We have many donors who legitimately fear those kinds of reprisal and choose to donate below a disclosure threshold. If you take that away, those donations dry up. And what is South Africa left with? South Africa is left with those political parties represented in Parliament who are being rejected. I mean, let's be very clear. In a country with the challenges like we have, with unemployment and crime and healthcare and load shedding and the challenges we have in South Africa, the fact that 26 million people of voting age did not find expression with any of those parties represented in Parliament, how does it make sense to fund an incumbency system to ensure that those in Parliament continue and new voices that could bring alternatives and that could speak to those 26 million people will be throttled because they cannot compete? And let's put this in perspective. When we talk about the 2019 general election, the information that we believe is that parties like the ANC's campaign cost around R1 billion with a B. Parties like the DA probably around 600 million rand. These are huge sums of money. And if you're going to take emerging political parties, which already have a number of challenges that they have to overcome naturally, and you're going to impose these kind of limitations upon their ability to raise funds, what South Africans will essentially see is campaigns run by the established political parties in Parliament, courtesy of you, the taxpayer, and emerging political parties struggling to even compete on that level. And that can't be the case in South Africa. It can't be the case where so many people are rejecting the political establishment. The basis for the IEC doing this, My Vote Counts doing this, is that they have essentially come to the view that donations from South Africans are effectively a slippery slope towards state capture and corruption. And how do they come to this conclusion, you might wonder? The State Capture Commission of Inquiry features very prominently in their papers. So effectively, because a State Capture Commission of Inquiry effectively found one political party to be involved in the buying of support in government through the support of a political party, it is now believed that all donations from South Africans across the board are corrupt or are a slippery slope. That is a huge assumption to make. ActionSA raises money from tens of thousands of people, and we don't get engaged to go and do this or that, or any conditions get placed on our donations. And the assumption that that is the case solely because of the ANC is a misguided notion. It must also be said that there are hugely important practicalities behind this. Because if a political party like ActionSA raises tens of thousands of donations through what we call micro donations, ordinary South Africans donating 10 Rand and 20 Rand, doing so of their own volition and coming forward and just going to your website and making a small contribution, the idea that that donation can buy influence in a political party it's a farce. If you imagine political parties spending the kinds of sums of money that I have just described, the idea that someone donating 20 Rand can be directing the policy of an organization, it's obscene. I mean, it has no credibility whatsoever. And if you even look at the papers of My Vote Counts, what they try and do to address their weakness in that regard is lump them all together and say, this party raised 1.5 million Rand in donations below the disclosure threshold, and see, that's why it's so important that these things are disclosed. But their assumption is that the person from the Eastern Cape who donated 10 Rand and the person from the Free State who donated 20 Rand got together and conspired to buy a political party with 30 Rand. It is no credibility behind that kind of thinking. And of course, when you say to a political party like ActionSA that you need to go and provide 12 data points on a person's information who gives you 10 Rand, the reality is we're going to spend more time and money chasing those 12 data points than the donation itself is actually worth. And when you have people who are trying to produce audits with 12 data points multiplied by tens of thousands of micro donors, effectively what you are left with is the need to have an accounting department to manage these kind of complexities, which of course we will not be able to afford because of how private fundraising is being targeted through this particular exercise. At the heart of My Vote Counts case is a concern only for those political parties represented in Parliament. And that's what we had sought to engage them with in a constructive and solution-orientated manner. Because their approach is to say, well, let's just state fund the political parties. We must make private fundraising very difficult, and the state must fund. But of course, they refer only to those parties represented in Parliament, just like they only chose to serve their papers on those political parties represented in Parliament, and not on other political parties that have not had the chance yet to fight a national provincial election, and that very clearly are going to be winning seats at a national and provincial level next year. So we are going to be opposing this case, and my team will be spending a bit of time talking with you this morning about the manner that we will be opposing the case. But there's one thing that I would like to do and say, which I think is massively important to back up the claim I made earlier about ActionSA being serious about transparency and not being anti the Party Funding Act. Let's make one thing clear first. If there's one political party in South Africa that has been compliant in the Party Funding Act to date, it is ActionSA. You will see we disclose every single quarter without fail. We have done our audit in the previous financial year, which was a clean audit and submitted to the IEC. And this takes place at a time where, let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen, political parties are running around spending sums of money that they're not disclosing. You all know what I'm talking about as members of the media. You see vastly expensive campaigns taking place out there and no disclosures at the same time. How can that be? How can political parties be putting fleets of vehicles on the grounds to fight by-election and they're disclosing 100,000 Rand for the financial year in question? It can't possibly be right. And this is where ActionSA is saying, don't go and make a new emerging political party's life more difficult, because that's not the fight that South Africans need you to have. The fight that South Africans need from civil society and organizations like My Vote Count, and let's be clear, civil society has an amazing role to play in South Africa in a country that is failing at a level of government, is to ensure we have compliance on the existing legislation. And as a matter of fact, what ActionSA will be saying in our court papers is we will be proposing solutions that will improve the current implementation of the Party Funding Act and not trying to do away with the idea that emerging political parties should be able to compete on an even playing field. So, for example, Our papers propose that a compliance unit, an investigations unit, has to be set up in the IEC so that complaints can be investigated. Right now, as we speak, there are complaints that you and I and everyone else have seen. A person left Good the other day and publicly alleged that there was failures to announce party funding there. What's happening there? I mean, the Democratic Alliance had an audit that did not meet the minimum accounting standards. What's happening there? The EFF is spending more money than they have announced. What is happening there? And we're never going to know. But rather than trying to change the law to deal with things that are not being dealt with, let's have the existing law put in place. And that's where these kind of investigations and compliance becomes hugely important. Part of that, for what it's worth, is we believe that the IEC should have access to legitimate, officially provided statements of political parties. Right now, the IEC, in the work that they are doing, take no interest in looking at your books to determine, like a lifestyle audit, whether a political party is expensing money in a manner that is commensurate with what they are producing by way of income. There's no process like that. Right now, the Party Funding Act and the compliance thereof is voluntary, if you want to call it that. And I don't mean voluntary in law, of course it's compulsory in law. But if a political party doesn't disclose, there is no process through which anyone can say there was something that should have been disclosed until there's an audit. And then a party produces an accountant that doesn't meet the minimum accounting standards. And then nothing happens. And you get the challenge that we're talking about. And this is why we say, as ActionSA, we are not opposed to transparency. We are not opposed to Party Funding Act. We would actually like other political parties to join us in being transparent in the manner in which they declare their donations. But what we are suggesting to My Vote Counts, and what we will be suggesting to the courts in this process, is there are more important ways of ensuring that that transparency actually exists and is being equally applied across the playing fields of parties. But the very worst thing that can be done in South Africa right now is challenge a system of new emerging parties that are needed for South Africans who have lost faith with the political establishment, so that it remains just the political establishment that is funded going forward. That would be the worst case for the very principles of democracy that this court paper is alleged to want to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Alistair?
Should we
I think
swap?
we should swap, yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lerato, and good morning to members of the media. So, simply put, My Vote Counts' papers seek to do two things. They seek to set aside the 100,000 Rand threshold. So every political party has to declare to the IEC any donation above that threshold, and then any individual or any juristic entity is prohibited from donating to a political party an amount of 15 million Rand or more in a financial year. Those are the primary things that they're seeking to have set aside. Now, going forward, ActionSA is applying to the Western Cape High Court, and we are applying to intervene as a co-respondent in this application. As the National Chair has already said, only the political parties represented in Parliament have been cited as respondents. However, the relief that My Vote Counts seeks will have an effect on every single represented political party. So we have a material interest in the outcome of these papers, and as such we are obviously filing an application to intervene. That application will require us to firstly state why we believe we are materially affected by the relief sought by My Vote Counts, which I think is quite clear, and I think our application has very strong prospects of success. And then we'll also have to briefly outline why we oppose the application. Once the court has ruled, hopefully in our favor, which I'm sure they will, that we can be admitted as a respondent in these papers, we will then file papers opposing the relief sought in the main application. And in that application, we will obviously be saying that whilst we support the transparency and accountability, there needs to be a balance between a blanket, every donation must be disclosed, as opposed to finding a balance between what is logistically reasonable and what types of donations have a material effect on the political parties. So briefly speaking, we will then obviously be opposing these two, the relief sought by My Vote Counts in that respect, because we're of the view that as it currently stands, the threshold is reasonable and is not irrational and unlawful as it currently stands. And then we obviously will be putting up alternatives to the court for the court to determine as to whether they should order the IEC or political parties to behave in a certain manner. So briefly speaking, that's the way going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Dr. Moya?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Briefly, I think it's also important that we share some of our of what we perceive to be challenges from a practical point of view. So, as Michael was saying, we're the only party that fully complies in South Africa currently when it comes to these donations. You may not be privy to the system that we use with the IEC, but basically what it means is that if My Vote Counts is successful in the court applications, it means that every party must arm itself with the system and the army of admins in order to comply. And that's something that we are saying. If we are saying that by the approach that is being proposed by My Vote Counts, we argue that it's going to shrink our coffers, that we're going to discourage people who want to donate. And when you talk about the systems that will be expected and the admin that will be expected in that, we're not going to afford it as political parties. So in terms of the system that the IEC uses for us to declare donations, Michael has already touched on it. That's a 12 data point system. And it's all compulsory. All those fields must be filled in. What it means is that when people donate, they must provide you with a certain type of information. The two issues with that: one, we also as the party, we take our POPIA compliance very seriously. And the second thing is that we have a dynamic way of raising money. We do for instance, debit orders. Sometimes they don't come with details of people. We do, the SMS donations. We don't have the details that are currently required on the IEC system. And we take our compliance seriously. And when we look at it, we're saying we are for the transparency. We are for compliance with the Party Funding Act, but we're just not buying the fact that there shouldn't be a limit on the monies that should be donated. So that's the first thing. The second thing, colleagues, that I just want to share is that we do have an issue also in terms of the IEC side to enforce the compliance of other political parties. Now, with us, we got a clean audit because, for instance, when you have a limit of 100K plus, you're talking, for instance, in our Q1 declaration, we only had 6. It took us a couple of days just to make sure that we comply when we were declaring those 6 donations. How much more when we have tens of thousands? And our argument is that we are for the transparency, but we just don't see just that parties like ourselves, we have to go through all this admin process when we foresee that if My Vote Counts application is successful, we're going to have many donors being discouraged to participate, to donate to parties like ActionSA. So on our side, I just wanted to share that part in terms of the practicality of what it will mean for us. And we just don't see that being just in this current context. But we still want to continue complying with the current one, with the proposals that we're making to make sure we strengthen how all political parties are being monitored, because we share the same fears that My Vote Counts. We also share the same fears that, we don't want a political system that can be bought, but we just saying that the issue of removal of the limit, we don't think it's going to assist greatly in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moya. I will open now for a Q&A. Please tell us who you are and which organization you represent and who your question is posed to. I'll take all the questions at the same time. All right, Junior, all right, at the back. So yeah, let's go that way. Thank you.
Junior. Oh, sorry. Junior Kumalo from Newsroom Africa. You speak about how this application by My Vote Counts affects newly established, especially political parties. Have you engaged other political parties that have been newly established? Are they in support of your court application? And in terms of, you're saying if there is a requirement for parties to disclose all the amounts and the threshold is removed, then it poses a serious problem. What is the difference between that and the ANC calling for an increase? Because the ANC is calling for an increase to about 500,000, if I'm not mistaken. So then should there not be any limit according to you, or should there be a reasonable limit? Should they keep it at 100,000?
Thanks. Just to add on to Junior, Aviva Mtila from ENCA. It's for anyone. Just to add on to Junior, what threshold do you want as Action SA? Because we know ANC wants it to be R500,000. What threshold does Action SA want? Secondly, you mentioned state capture and it only focusing largely on one political party, the ANC. But don't you think that this would actually ensure that no other political parties have, dark shenanigans happening if they are transparent about their funding? Also, you mentioned, it will make donors shy away from funding small parties. And it seems to suggest that it's because of their association with the ANC, whether it be via government or however. But Action SA has actually been bold enough to say that they don't want to do business with, they don't want to be aligned with the ANC. They're very anti-ANC. Why would you then want donors that are associated with the ANC, whether it be via government or anything of the sort? Because clearly you don't want anything to do with the ANC. Wouldn't you want to be transparent in saying that these are our donors and all of them have nothing to do with the African National Congress or other parties that may found wanting? You want to be open and transparent, as this is what's funding us and this is why we Action SA.
For the live stream, you do.
Okay, so to answer that last question first, because there's a lot going on there and there's a lot of critical issues you capture quite quickly, is that the subject of the threshold, in our opinion, the threshold currently is fine. In other words, it is our view that no one plausibly can buy influence in a political party for 100,000 rand. I think anything that the ANC is doing, we need to watch what are the motives, because we must understand it is with the ANC's majority that this act was passed in the first place. So what has changed since then and now? I think we've seen it. There have been countless occasions where people are protesting outside the ANC's offices because they can't pay salaries. There's rumored that there's unpaid bills for PAYE, et cetera, et cetera. So effectively the ANC is trying to litigate itself out of, or legislate, I should say, itself, out of financial predicaments, which is hugely irresponsible when you regard, once again, that they are the majority that drafted and authorized this legislation in the first place. So we will watch that with great interest. It's very important to say that the very same system which we are excluded from a finance point of view, we also are not involved from a parliamentary point of view. So we must watch that from a distance and comment upon it. But that ultimately, I don't think the battle is relating to changing thresholds. The battle is about compliance. And if we can get compliance right, that's where the fight has to be. I think from that point of view, when it talks about wouldn't these donations stop corruption in political parties, there's no doubt that if you had greater forms of accountability and transparency, it stops that. Because let's be clear, state capture started with party capture. No one captured the state before they captured the ANC. That was what was very clear in the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. I guess my point is to say, if we are going to use the ANC as the yardstick in measuring all political parties, I think invariably you're going to be applying principles that are not at play with other organizations that don't have the same proven track record when it comes to financial impropriety. As it relates to, just one thing, if you don't mind me saying, ActionSA being anti-ANC, I hope you don't mind me just taking issue with that for a moment. We don't regard ourselves as anti-ANC. We are anti what the ANC has done to this country. I think that there are a lot of people who are ANC supporters out there who feel the system that benefits only incumbents, and then you kill the only leg left with which we can raise money to fight campaigns in the form of fundraising from South Africans. I think that's the real fear in that particular regard. Junior, as it talks about the other political parties, I've had informal engagements with others. I think they've shared our concern. I think a number of them are very nervous to come forward and challenge this litigation. And I mean, there are going to be people who try to mischaracterize what we are doing here today as that we're anti, transparency and accountability. And I've gone to great lengths to demonstrate that that's not the case. I think some political parties are probably from a distance going to be watching us and be very happy rooting us on from the sidelines. But at the end of the day, there's no question that they are as affected as we are. Because let's bear this in mind. ActionSA was launched in 2020, the year after a national provincial election. In that time frame, that means we would have to operate for 4 years before we would get the first opportunity to win representation in a National Assembly and provincial legislature, where party funding is meted out. And to give you an example of how generous the South African taxpayer is, courtesy of their representatives in parliaments, when you win one seat in a provincial legislature like Gauteng, the party funding you receive with that is a region of 6 million rand per annum. So political parties are generously awarding themselves budget to fight campaigns, to have offices, to be able to brand themselves with marketing gear, etc. And this is why, we are saying, if you kick out, fundraising from South Africans and you make it difficult because people fear reprisals, you really are going to ensure that emerging parties for 4 years that they cannot compete with the established players. I think I've commented on the threshold as well, so I think we can probably deal with that. Sorry, Loretta. Just never asked them that.
Good afternoon. My name is Sisanda Mboleko from the Sunday Times. Michael, just briefly, prior to this litigation, has ActionSA approached or exhausted engagements with My Vote Counts to provide inputs on how their court bid will affect emerging parties that aren't listed as respondents? And I think secondly, you've touched briefly on it, on why it is that donors would potentially shy away from donating. But if there are any other reasons that you can think of in this regard, then please kindly share that with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. It's Caroline James from Ambungani. I think I just wanted to clarity on the comments around being sort of pro-transparency. I see two arguments in your opposition, and the one is a very practical element that SMSs and simple donations both would cause big practical obligations on you, but also are impractical to get that information. But then the more sort of substantive argument that having or lowering the disclosure would discourage donors from donating. And to me, that seems like more of a sort of response to a transparency argument, that the reason for the act is to allow voters to understand where money comes from in political parties and who is funding the parties, to understand a sense of who the parties not necessarily represent, but their sort of values of the parties, and the funders can dictate that. And I think we have seen the reality that individuals are able to avoid disclosure by making multiple donations of under 100,000 through different entities. And that does link a little bit more to the need for transparency. So just perhaps a comment on how those two different oppositions interact and how you still are able to sort of push for that transparency with the concern around discouraging donors. Sure. Yeah, so essentially, I see that there are two legs to your opposition. The one is a practical leg, and then the other is to ensure that donors are not discouraged from it. Does your opposition, on the grounds that you don't want to discourage donors, not threaten transparency in political funding because it means that that voters are not able to understand who is backing your party?
No, sure. For what it's worth, and I mean, I actually very deliberately highlighted the following from the Constitutional Court, which is particularly relevant as it relates to the intention. Because, well, My Vote Counts wants to frame the intention in the way that obviously is beneficial to them. It is the Constitutional Court that kind of was the midwife, if you will, of this act in transparency. And effectively it says, Constitutional Court found that any information that completes the picture of a political party into relation to who a political party could be influenced by, in what way could such influence be exerted, and to what extent, is essential for voters to exercise their will in an informed and effective manner, which is a principle we fully prescribe to. I think the question which we must deal with here is, practically, can a donation of 50 Rand reasonably buy influence in a political party? I think that's the part that we need to be serious about. I mean, political parties, and I've given you an idea of the quantum of money that is spent on election campaigns. South African election campaigns are extraordinarily expensive because we don't have the same data access that you have in the developed world. So when you have the notion that the act is intended to determine, well, to empower voters to be able to see who political parties are influenced by, the extent to which they may be influenced, and in what manner. We must be real about this, that at some point an exercise had to be conducted to say, what is a reasonable limit after which, influence is foreseeably possible, but below which it's just not reasonably likely that it could be taking place. The IEC came to the conclusion that 100,000 Rand was that limit. I mean, I think that limit, is fairly low in terms of what influence could be bought by a political by a donor for a political party. But at the same time, that's the limit that they came to, and they also had to address it from the practical point of view, because the reality is you would have to have floors and floors of accountants in the IEC if you're going to have disclosures of every single donation in the amount of tens of thousands per political party. And I think that is the essence of what My Vote Counts is getting wrong, is that they are trying to allege that any amount of money is material to the extent to which a political party could be influenced. And aside from it just not being reasonable or logical, effectively, they are missing the very point of this exercise, which is the South African voter. Now, I ask you, you're a member of the media, but you're a South African voter as well, presumably. You engage in these thoughts yourself. Do you lie in bed at night wondering who donated 10 Rand to a political party? Does it keep you up? No, I didn't think it would. So, again, this is where it's reasonable. But I understand when you talk about millions, that certainly is where reasonably that exercise needs to take place. In fact, there's a number of times where My Vote Counts actually ends up making our argument for us, I think, unwittingly, where, for example, they talk about the case of various donations relating to entities associated with Patrice Motsepe, and linking those entities through one connection after another to, I think, drilling licenses somewhere in the country. Now, they're actually making the case for why compliance on the existing legislation is what is necessary, because they know that because it was disclosed. And it was disclosed because it was over a threshold. And it was over a threshold because it was an amount of money that plausibly could result in that kind of thing. And kudos to the South African media for drawing the links between those companies that get you there, because that was the intention for political parties to see when, for South Africans to see when political parties are receiving funds and there's a connection directly where state funds are benefiting people associated with those donors. I think that's really got to be regarded to be the intention behind the act. But as it relates to the interplay between the practicalities and the transparency, we've got to take our cue from the Constitutional Court. It was what would reasonably amount to a sum of money which could influence a political party. And the idea that R1 is going to do that, or that the South African voter is going to be pondering deeply over whether it was R1 or 2, really for me it's not a reasonable thought at all. Sisanda, we have engaged My Vote Counts. We wrote to them formally as part of this process through our attorneys and said, we think you are operating off a good principle. We don't think that what you're doing principally is wrong, but we think your application is way off. Because we think what you are doing is producing unintended consequences that are perhaps even worse than what it is you're trying to solve. Because if you're going to kill multi-party democracy in South Africa by saying to South Africans, those guys in parliament are all you have, you're going to see a continued trend to what we have right now, where millions of South Africans, despite having every reason to vote, say there's no reason in that parliament for me to get out of bed. And if you kill that, you are committing, in our opinion, a far greater offense to the very multi-party democracy you want to fight for, which is why we reached out to them. We thought, you know what, let us come to you and let's engage. We could actually talk to you about what we are proposing in our papers from a party funding point of view to give real teeth and real meaning to compliance as it is right now, which they would have benefited from. I think they would have benefited greatly had they actually spoken to a political party, one that has a track record in being compliant with the legislation, one that has a real experience with what fundraising is actually like on a practical level and not a theoretical level. I note, by the way, My Vote Counts doesn't disclose their donors. And at the end of the day, they would have benefited greatly were they to have listened to us and actually been able to refine their papers so we can address the real challenge in the room, which is political parties that are just voluntarily deciding what they will disclose and what they won't.